The Anchor Bar sat on the edge of downtown San Diego, its neon sign flickering against the humid evening air. Inside, the familiar sounds of clinking glasses and rough laughter filled the smoky atmosphere. This wasn't the kind of place where people came to impress anyone. It was where off-duty sailors, mechanics, and dock workers came to forget about their day and drink cheap beer. Sarah Martinez sat alone at the far end of the bar, her fingers wrapped around a half-empty bottle of Corona. She wore simple jeans and a black t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything more than another local grabbing a quiet drink after work. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete who'd been working here for 15 years, occasionally glanced her way, but otherwise left her alone. At 34, Sarah had learned to blend in wherever she went. It was a skill that had served her well throughout her career, though most people in this bar would never guess what that career actually involved. She preferred it that way. Tonight was supposed to be one of those rare evenings where she could just be another face in the crowd, where nobody knew her rank or her responsibilities. The front door swung open with a bang, letting in a gust of warm air and the sound of traffic from the street outside. 3 men walked in, their voices already loud from whatever they'd been drinking before they arrived. Sarah didn't look up immediately, but she could hear them clearly as they approached the bar. "This place is perfect," one of them said, his voice carrying the slight slur of someone who'd had a few drinks already. "Look at all these locals. Bet none of them have ever been more than 50 miles from this dump." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her eyes on her beer. She'd heard this kind of talk before, usually from people who thought their money or their job titles made them better than everyone else. The 3 men settled at the bar about 6 seats down from Sarah. The one who'd been talking was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the Anchor Bar. His blonde hair was slicked back, and he wore a gold watch that probably cost more than most people here made in a month. His name was Brad Thornton, though Sarah didn't know that yet. 3 whiskeys, Brad told Pete the bartender. "Top shelf. None of that cheap stuff you probably serve these people." Pete's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw his hands tense slightly as he reached for the bottles. He'd dealt with difficult customers before, but there was something particularly obnoxious about these 3. Brad's 2 companions were cut from similar cloth. One was shorter and stockier, with thinning brown hair and a permanent smirk. The other was lean and nervous-looking, constantly checking his phone and glancing around the bar like he was afraid someone might recognize him. "I'm telling you guys," Brad continued, his voice getting louder as Pete poured their drinks, "this whole area is full of losers, military wannabes, and working-class nobodies who think they're tough because they can fix a car or operate some machinery." Several other patrons glanced in their direction, but most chose to ignore the comments. This was the kind of bar where people minded their own business, even when that business was getting loud and obnoxious. Sarah took a slow sip of her beer and continued listening. She'd encountered men like Brad before, usually in different circumstances. They were always the same type, successful in some narrow area of their lives, and convinced that success made them superior to everyone else. They loved to throw their weight around, especially when they thought they were surrounded by people who couldn't fight back. "Look at this place," the shorter man said, gesturing around the bar with his whiskey glass. "I bet the combined income of everyone here is less than what I made last quarter. Probably less than what I made last month," Brad laughed, taking a large gulp of his drink. "These people have no ambition, no drive. They're content to live their little lives in their little world, never achieving anything meaningful." The nervous-looking man shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should keep it down a bit, Brad. We don't want to cause any trouble." "Trouble?" Brad's laugh was sharp and unpleasant. "What kind of trouble could any of these people cause? Look around, Danny. We've got dock workers, mechanics, maybe a few sailors on shore leave. None of them are exactly intimidating." Sarah's hand tightened around her beer bottle. She'd been in situations where keeping quiet was the smart choice, where revealing who she was would complicate things unnecessarily. But there was something about Brad's tone, the casual cruelty in his voice, that was starting to wear on her patience. Pete finished pouring their drinks and stepped back, clearly hoping they'd settle down now that they had what they wanted. But Brad wasn't finished talking. You know what the problem is with people like this? He continued, now speaking loud enough that half the bar could hear him clearly. They have no real skills, no real value. They do simple jobs that anyone could do, and they think that makes them special. They think their little blue-collar jobs make them heroes or something. The stocky man nodded along enthusiastically. Exactly. They probably think being in the military makes them tough guys. Like anyone can't learn to march around and follow orders. Military service, Brad said with a dismissive wave, is what people do when they can't cut it in the real world. When they're not smart enough or ambitious enough to build something meaningful. It's welfare for people who can't compete in actual careers. A few more heads turned in their direction, and Sarah noticed the tension level in the room starting to rise. There were indeed several off-duty servicemen in the bar, and Brad's comments were hitting close to home for more than just her. I mean, seriously, Brad continued, seemingly oblivious to the hostile looks he was receiving. What does the military actually do? They play with expensive toys that taxpayers buy for them. They travel around the world on the government's dime, and then they come home and expect everyone to treat them like heroes. It's a joke. Sarah set her beer down carefully and turned slightly on her bar stool. For the first time since the three men had entered, she looked directly at Brad. He was even more obnoxious up close, with the kind of arrogant expression that suggested he'd never been seriously challenged in his life. The real heroes, Brad was saying, are people like us. People who build businesses, who create jobs, who actually contribute to society instead of just being a drain on it. These military types wouldn't last 5 minutes in the real world. Danny, the nervous one, noticed Sarah looking in their direction. Brad, he said quietly, maybe we should talk about something else. But Brad was on a roll now, fueled by alcohol and his own sense of superiority. Why? You worried about offending someone? Look around, Danny. Do you see anyone here who looks like they could be a problem for us? His gaze swept the bar dismissively, passing over Sarah without really seeing her. That was his first mistake. I've been thinking about expanding my business into this area, Brad continued. Lots of cheap labor available. These people are so desperate for work, they'll take whatever you offer them. No negotiating power, no real skills to leverage. It's perfect. The stocky man chuckled. Plus, they're probably intimidated by successful people. Makes them easier to manage. Exactly, Brad agreed. Show them a little authority, a little success, and they fold immediately. They're used to taking orders anyway. Sarah had heard enough. She stood up slowly, leaving her beer on the bar, and walked over to where the three men were sitting. Her movement was calm and controlled, but there was something about her posture that made Pete the bartender pay attention. Excuse me, Sarah said, her voice polite but firm. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. Brad turned to look at her, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to something approaching interest as he took in her appearance. Sarah was an attractive woman, and Brad clearly thought this might be going a direction he'd enjoy. Well, hello there, he said, his voice taking on what he probably thought was a charming tone. I hope we weren't being too loud for you. Actually, Sarah replied, I was more interested in what you were saying about military service. You seem to have some strong opinions about it. Brad's companions exchanged glances. Danny looked increasingly uncomfortable, while the stocky man seemed eager to see where this was going. I do have opinions about it, Brad said, straightening up on his bar stool. I believe in speaking the truth, even when it's not popular. Military service is basically government welfare disguised as patriotism. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting perspective. You must have some experience with the military to have such definite views. Experience? Brad laughed. I don't need experience to see what's obvious. I'm a businessman. I deal in results, in productivity, in actual achievement. The military is the opposite of all that. How so? Sarah asked, her tone remaining neutral. Brad seemed pleased to have an audience for his theories. It's simple economics. The military takes people who can't succeed in the private sector and gives them jobs that don't produce anything valuable. They play war games with equipment that costs billions of dollars. And for what? To fight enemies that wouldn't exist if we minded our own business in the first place. Several other patrons had stopped their own conversations to listen. Pete the bartender had moved closer, ostensibly to clean glasses, but actually to keep an eye on the situation. Plus, the stocky man added, military people think they're better than everyone else just because they wear a uniform. Like that makes them special or something. Sarah's expression remained calm, but something in her eyes shifted. You think people in the military believe they're better than civilians? Of course they do, Brad said confidently. They've got this whole superiority complex about serving their country and protecting freedom. It's all nonsense designed to make them feel important about their government jobs. And you think they wouldn't be able to handle real-world challenges? Sarah asked. I know they wouldn't, Brad replied. Look, sweetheart, I've built 3 successful companies from the ground up. I employ hundreds of people. I've negotiated million-dollar deals with some of the toughest businessmen in the country. That's real pressure, real responsibility. These military types think they're tough because they could do push-ups and follow orders, but they've never faced real challenges. The word sweetheart had been a mistake, though Brad didn't realize it yet. Sarah's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, and Pete the bartender recognized the change immediately. He'd seen it before in other military personnel when someone crossed a line they shouldn't have crossed. Real challenges, Sarah repeated. Like what specifically? Brad was warming to his theme now, clearly enjoying what he thought was a conversation with an impressed local woman. Like making decisions that affect hundreds of jobs. Like risking your own money on business ventures. Like competing in markets where failure means bankruptcy, not just getting transferred to another base. Those do sound challenging, Sarah agreed. Though I imagine there might be other kinds of challenges that are difficult in different ways. Such as, Sarah was quiet for a moment, as if considering how to respond. Around them, the bar had gone noticeably quieter. Even people at the far end of the room seemed to be paying attention now. Well, she said finally, I was thinking about the challenge of making life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure, or leading teams in situations where failure means people die rather than just losing money, or maintaining discipline and effectiveness when you're operating in hostile territory with limited resources and no backup coming. Brad waved dismissively. Movie fantasy stuff. Real life isn't like that, isn't it? Sarah asked. Something in her tone made Danny shift nervously on his stool. He was starting to get the feeling that this conversation wasn't going the way Brad thought it was going. Look, Brad said, his voice taking on a slightly condescending tone, I can see you've probably got family in the military or something, and I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. But the reality is that military service is just a job, and not a particularly demanding one. These people aren't heroes. They're government employees with better marketing. Government employees, Sarah repeated. Exactly. They get guaranteed paychecks, guaranteed benefits, guaranteed housing. They don't have to compete for anything or prove their worth in the marketplace. It's the easiest career path available for people who can't handle real responsibility. The stocky man nodded enthusiastically. And they act like they're doing the rest of us some huge favor. Like we should be grateful to them for their service. He made air quotes around the word, his expression mocking. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. You don't think military service is valuable? I think it's an expensive jobs program, Brad interjected before his friend could answer. We spend billions of dollars so people can play soldier and feel important about themselves. Meanwhile, people like me are actually creating value, actually building the economy that pays for their little games. Their little games, Sarah repeated quietly. That's right. And the worst part is how they try to intimidate civilians with their whole tough guy act. Like we're supposed to be impressed by their uniforms and their medals and their stories about how dangerous their jobs are. Brad leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on what he probably thought was an intimate tone. But between you and me, sweetheart, most of these military tough guys are all talk. They're trained to follow orders, not to think for themselves. Put them in a situation where they have to actually lead, where they have to make real decisions with real consequences, and they fall apart. You really believe that? Sarah asked. I know it for a fact, Brad replied confidently. I met plenty of ex-military guys in business settings. They're always talking about their service, try to use it to get respect they haven't earned. But when it comes to actual performance, they're nothing special. Usually less than special, actually, because they're so used to having everything structured and organized for them. Sarah nodded slowly. So you think if you encountered someone from the military, you could essentially, what? Outmaneuver them? Intimidate them? Brad's smile was broad and unpleasant. Absolutely. These people are used to a very specific environment with very specific rules. Take them out of that environment, put them in the real world where success depends on intelligence and adaptability instead of just following protocols, and they're lost. Interesting theory, Sarah said. It's not a theory, it's a fact, Brad replied. And I'll tell you something else. Most of them know it. Deep down, they know they're not as tough or as capable as they pretend to be. That's why they stick together in groups and hide behind their military identity. It's a security blanket for people who can't handle real life. Danny was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Something about Sarah's calm demeanor in the face of Brad's increasingly offensive comments was setting off alarm bells in his head. But Brad was too intoxicated by his own voice and too convinced of his own superiority to notice. The truth is, Brad continued, if you really want to see someone from the military back down, all you have to do is show them they're dealing with someone who's actually successful in the real world. Someone who's achieved something meaningful. They fold immediately because they know they're outclassed. They fold, Sarah said. Every time. They're basically bullies who are only tough when they think they're dealing with people who can't fight back. But show them real authority, real success, and they remember their place pretty quickly. Sarah was quiet for several seconds, and the silence seemed to stretch out longer than it actually lasted. Pete the bartender had stopped even pretending to clean glasses and was watching the interaction with growing interest. That's a fascinating perspective, Sarah finally said. I have to admit, I've never really thought about it that way before. Brad's smile widened. He was clearly pleased with himself and convinced that he was impressing this attractive woman with his insights and his success. Most people don't think about it, he replied. They just accept the mythology without questioning it. But when you really analyze what the military actually does versus what they claim to do, the disconnect is obvious. What do you do for work, Brad? Sarah asked. Since you mentioned building companies. Brad straightened up, clearly happy to talk about his favorite subject, himself. I'm in commercial real estate development. I've built shopping centers, office complexes, residential developments. I employ over 200 people across 3 companies, and I've got projects in development worth over $50 million. Impressive, Sarah said, and Brad didn't catch the subtle note in her voice that suggested she might not be as impressed as he hoped. It is impressive, Brad agreed without false modesty, especially when you consider that I started with nothing and built it all through my own intelligence and hard work. No government handouts, no guaranteed paychecks, no safety net. Just pure competition in the free market. And that's given you confidence in dealing with all kinds of people, Sarah observed. Absolutely. When you've negotiated with bank presidents and city council members and union bosses, when you've had to convince investors to trust you with millions of dollars, dealing with regular people becomes pretty straightforward. Even people who might seem intimidating to others. Brad laughed. Especially them. See, most people are intimidated by appearances, by uniforms or titles or tough talk. But I look at results. I look at actual achievement. And when you do that, it's pretty easy to see through the pretenses. So if someone tried to intimidate you, Sarah said, you'd be able to handle it? Without breaking a sweat, Brad replied confidently. I've dealt with people trying to intimidate me my whole career. Real estate development isn't for the weak. You're constantly dealing with people who think they can push you around, contractors trying to renegotiate deals, city officials looking for bribes, competitors trying to sabotage your projects. I've seen every trick in the book. And you've never backed down? Never. Not once. Because I know something that a lot of people don't understand. Confidence comes from actual achievement, not from pretending to be something you're not. When you've really accomplished something significant, when you've really built something valuable, you don't need to posture or make threats. Your success speaks for itself. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. So you think you can generally tell when someone is truly accomplished versus when they're just putting on an act? I can spot a fake from across the room, Brad said proudly. It's all in the details. How they carry themselves, how they talk, what they focus on in conversation. Real success has a certain signature to it, and fake authority is usually pretty obvious once you know what to look for. The stocky man decided to jump back into the conversation. Brad's got great instincts about people. He can size up anyone in about 5 minutes. Is that right? Sarah asked, looking directly at Brad. It's a skill you develop, Brad replied modestly. When you're responsible for hiring decisions, for choosing business partners, for evaluating potential threats and opportunities, you learn to read people quickly and accurately. And what do you read when you look at me? Sarah asked. The question seemed to catch Brad off guard for just a moment, but he recovered quickly. Well, you're clearly intelligent. You're asking good questions. You're thinking about what I'm saying instead of just reacting emotionally like most people do when I talk about the military. You're probably college educated, maybe working in an office somewhere. Professional, but not executive level. Probably dating someone in the military, which is why you're interested in this topic. Sarah's expression remained neutral. Interesting assessment. Am I close? Brad asked, clearly pleased with his analysis. Some parts are closer than others, Sarah replied diplomatically. I figured. Like I said, reading people is just something you develop when you're in leadership positions. You have to be able to assess capabilities and motivations quickly, especially when you're dealing with people who might not be entirely honest about their qualifications or their intentions. And you've never been wrong about someone? Sarah asked. Oh, I'm sure I've been wrong about details, Brad admitted. But about the big picture, about whether someone is truly capable or just putting on a show. No, I'm pretty much always right about that. It's too important to get wrong in my business. Danny was fidgeting with his phone, clearly wishing this conversation would end. But Brad was enjoying himself too much to stop now. The thing is, Brad continued, most people go through life accepting things at face value. They see a uniform or hear a job title and automatically assume it means something significant. But when you've actually achieved real success, when you've actually built something meaningful, you develop the ability to see through those surface appearances to what's really underneath. And what do you think is really underneath when it comes to military personnel? Sarah asked. Mostly insecurity, Brad replied without hesitation. People who chose a structured, predictable career path because they were afraid to compete in the real world. They're playing a role, following a script, pretending to be something they're not. And deep down, they know it. So you think if you encountered someone who was actually highly accomplished in the military, say, someone who had risen to a position of real responsibility and authority, you'd be able to see through that as well. Brad's smile was confident and dismissive, especially then. The higher they get in the military hierarchy, the more invested they become in maintaining the illusion of their own importance. But it's still just a government job. It's still just following orders and managing people who are also just following orders. There's no real creation, no real innovation, no real risk. No real risk, Sarah repeated. That's right. Everything in the military is scripted and planned and backed up by massive resources. These people never have to truly go out on a limb, never have to bet everything on their own judgment, never have to succeed or fail based purely on their own abilities. Sarah was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider this. Around them, the bar had grown quite still. Even the background music seemed quieter. You know, she said finally, I think you might be overestimating your ability to read people. Brad's confident expression flickered slightly. What do you mean? Well, you've been talking for the past 20 minutes about military personnel, their motivations, their capabilities, their character, and you seem very certain about your conclusions. I am certain, Brad replied, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. But, Sarah continued, you've been making all these assessments without actually knowing whether there's anyone in this bar who might prove your theories wrong. Brad looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the other patrons with slightly less confidence than before. What are you getting at? I'm getting at the fact that you've spent this entire conversation assuming you understand the people around you. You've assumed you can read their backgrounds, their capabilities, their worth. But what if one of your assumptions was completely wrong? The nervous energy that had been building in Danny finally reached a breaking point. Maybe we should head somewhere else, he suggested. It's getting kind of late. But Sarah wasn't finished. What if, for example, someone sitting at this bar wasn't just a government employee or a dock worker or whatever other category you've assigned to the people here? What if someone here had actually achieved the kind of real authority and real responsibility that you claim to respect? Brad's jaw tightened. He was starting to realize that this conversation wasn't going the way he had planned. Are you trying to make some kind of point? I'm just wondering, Sarah said calmly, what you would do if it turned out that your ability to read people wasn't as accurate as you think it is. Brad stared at Sarah for a long moment, his confident smile fading as he tried to process what she was suggesting. The atmosphere in the bar had shifted noticeably. Conversations at other tables had stopped entirely, and everyone seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Look, Brad said, his voice taking on a slightly defensive edge. I don't know what game you're trying to play here, but I've been perfectly honest about my opinions. If you disagree with them, that's your right. But don't try to make this into something it's not. Sarah nodded slowly. You're absolutely right that you've been honest about your opinions. Very honest. You made it very clear that you believe military personnel are essentially government welfare recipients who hide behind uniforms and tough talk. You've stated that they would fold under pressure from someone with real authority and real success. You've claimed that they're incapable of handling actual leadership or making meaningful decisions. That's right, Brad replied, though he sounded less certain than before. And you've also stated that you can read people accurately, that you can spot fake authority from across the room, and that your success in business has given you the ability to see through pretenses and identify people's true capabilities. Brad's friends were now looking distinctly uncomfortable. Danny was actively trying to catch Brad's attention, making small gestures that suggested they should leave immediately. But Brad either didn't notice or chose to ignore him. I stand by everything I've said, Brad declared, though his voice lacked the easy confidence it had carried earlier. I'm sure you do, Sarah replied. Which brings me to an interesting question. If someone in this bar turned out to be exactly the kind of person you've been describing, say a high-ranking military officer with real authority and real responsibility, what do you think you would do? What kind of question is that? Brad asked. A practical one, Sarah answered. You've spent the last 20 minutes explaining how you can intimidate military personnel, how they back down when faced with real success, how they're essentially paper tigers who can't handle actual confrontation. So I'm curious what your strategy would be if you were actually faced with that situation. Brad looked around the bar again, this time more carefully. He was beginning to realize that the other patrons weren't just casually listening to their conversation. They were watching with the kind of focused attention that suggested they knew something he didn't. Are you saying? Brad began, then stopped. I'm not saying anything yet, Sarah replied. I'm just wondering if you'd stick to your principles if it turned out your situation was different than you assumed it was. The stocky man decided to jump in. Come on, Brad. Let's just get out of here. This whole thing is getting weird. But Brad's pride wouldn't let him back down now. He'd committed too strongly to his position, been too vocal about his opinions. Leaving now would feel too much like retreat. You know what? He said, his voice getting louder again. Fine. Let's say hypothetically there is someone military in this bar. I'd tell them exactly what I've been saying. The truth doesn't change just because someone's feelings might get hurt. The truth, Sarah repeated. That's right. That military service is an easy career for people who can't cut it in the real world. That these people aren't as tough or as capable as they pretend to be. That real authority comes from real achievement, not from government jobs and fancy uniforms. Sarah was quiet for several seconds, and the silence stretched out uncomfortably. Brad could hear the sound of his own breathing, could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. Well, Sarah said finally, I guess we're about to test your theories. What do you mean? Brad asked, though something in his voice suggested he was beginning to understand. Sarah reached into her back pocket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. She opened it carefully and placed it on the bar between them, positioning it so Brad could see the contents clearly. Inside was a military identification card with Sarah's photo, along with several other credentials. But it was the rank insignia and the unit information that made Brad's face go completely pale. Commander Sarah Martinez, she said calmly, United States Navy, currently serving as CEO of SEAL Team 7. The silence that followed was so complete that Brad could hear the hum of the neon beer signs on the wall. Every person in the bar was staring now, not at Sarah but at him, waiting to see what he would do next. Brad stared at the identification for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only a few seconds. His mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. Danny made a small, choking noise beside him. "That's—" Brad started, then stopped. "I'm a government employee," Sarah said, her voice still perfectly calm. "Just like you said, drawing a government paycheck, living in government housing, following orders, and giving orders within a very structured system." Brad's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his whiskey glass. He took a large gulp, then set it down with more force than necessary. "But here's the thing," Sarah continued. "Those orders I follow and give, they involve leading teams of the most highly trained special operations soldiers in the world into situations where the margin for error is essentially zero, where one wrong decision means people die, where the pressure is so intense that most people, even very successful, very confident people, would completely break down." Brad was staring at her now with the expression of someone who had just realized he was standing in the middle of a minefield. "And those government resources you mentioned?" Sarah went on. "They're nice when they're available. But most of the time, my teams operate in places where there is no backup, no safety net, no second chances. Where success depends entirely on training, skill, and the ability to make life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure with incomplete information." She picked up her identification and slipped it back into her wallet with the same calm precision with which she'd produced it. "So, I have to say, I'm curious about something. You've spent this entire evening explaining how people like me would fold when confronted by people like you, about how our authority is fake and our toughness is just an act, about how we back down immediately if faced with real success and real confidence." Brad tried to speak, but could only manage a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at words. "So here's your chance," Sarah said. "Here's your opportunity to prove everything you've been saying. I'm exactly the kind of person you've been talking about. A high-ranking military officer who probably thinks she's tough, who probably believes her own hype, who probably gets respect she hasn't earned." She gestured slightly with one hand, a movement that somehow managed to encompass the entire bar and everyone in it. "And you're exactly the kind of person you claim to be. Successful businessman, real achievement, actual authority in the real world. Someone who can see through military pretenses and intimidate government employees who get too full of themselves." The pause that followed was so tense that several people seemed to be holding their breath. "So," Sarah concluded, "let's see how this works out." Brad opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. His face had gone from pale to red and was now settling into an unhealthy-looking gray color. Sweat was running down his forehead, and his hands were visibly trembling. Danny finally found his voice. "Look, we didn't mean... Brad was just talking. We don't want any trouble." Sarah turned her attention to Danny, and he immediately looked like he regretted speaking. "I understand that Brad was just talking," she said, "and I'm not looking for trouble either. But I'm interested in seeing whether his theories hold up under practical testing." She looked back at Brad, who seemed to be having difficulty breathing normally. "For instance, you mentioned that military people try to intimidate civilians with tough guy acts. So I'm wondering, do you feel intimidated right now?" Brad's mouth worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to croak out, "No, no." Sarah asked, tilting her head slightly. "Are you sure? Because you look like you might be having some kind of physical reaction to this conversation." "I'm fine," Brad said, though his voice was at least an octave higher than it had been earlier in the evening. "That's good," Sarah replied, "because according to your earlier statements, you should be able to handle this situation easily. After all, I'm just a government employee with a fake authority, hiding behind a uniform, and try to intimidate someone with real success." Brad looked desperately toward the exit, but Sarah's position and the arrangement of the other bar patrons made it clear that leaving would require walking directly past her. "Of course," Sarah continued conversationally, "there might be some aspects of military leadership that you haven't considered in your analysis. For example, People often assume that commanding special operations units is similar to managing civilian employees. But there are some significant differences. She took a sip of her beer, seemingly oblivious to the effect her words were having on Brad. Civilian employees, even in high-pressure industries like real estate development, generally operate within legal and social constraints. They have HR departments, union protections, legal recourse if they feel they're being treated unfairly. They work during business hours, go home to their families, pursue hobbies, and social lives. Brad's breathing was becoming increasingly labored. Military special operations personnel, on the other hand, are trained to operate completely outside normal social constraints. They're trained to use violence efficiently and without hesitation. They're trained to function in situations where normal rules don't apply, where the only thing that matters is completing the mission and keeping their teammates alive. Sarah's voice remained perfectly calm and conversational, as if she were discussing the weather rather than describing lethal capabilities. And when you're commanding people like that, she continued, you can't rely on HR policies or legal frameworks or social conventions to maintain discipline and effectiveness. You have to be someone they respect absolutely, someone they trust completely, someone they would follow into situations that would break most people's minds. Brad tried to take another drink of whiskey, but his hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped the glass. So when you talk about intimidating military personnel, Sarah said, you might want to consider that the people you're talking about have been trained by experts to handle extreme pressure, to function effectively when faced with serious threats, and to respond appropriately to people who might pose a danger to themselves or their teammates. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Brad's increasingly rapid breathing. Now, Sarah said, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not threatening you. I'm not looking for a fight. I'm not trying to prove anything about military superiority or civilian inferiority. I'm simply pointing out that your theories about military personnel might be based on incomplete information. She gestured toward his trembling hands and his obvious physical distress. For example, you claimed that military people would fold when confronted by real authority and real success. But looking at our interactions so far, it seems like the folding might be going in the opposite direction. Brad made a sound that might have been an attempt to speak, but it came out as more of a whimper. You also claimed that you could spot fake authority from across the room, that your success in business had given you the ability to read people accurately. But you've been sitting 3 feet away from me for the past half hour, and you completely misread who I am and what I'm capable of. Danny was now tugging desperately at Brad's sleeve, trying to get him to stand up and leave. But Brad seemed frozen in place, unable to move or speak coherently. And most importantly, Sarah continued, you claimed that you had never backed down from intimidation, that your real-world success had given you the confidence to handle any kind of confrontation. But right now, you look like you're about to pass out from fear. Brad's face was now a sickly gray-green color, and sweat was pouring down his face despite the cool air conditioning. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and he seemed to be having trouble focusing his eyes. So I think we can safely say, Sarah concluded, that your theories about military personnel versus civilian achievers might need some revision. Pete, the bartender, who had been watching the entire interaction with fascination, finally stepped forward. Ma'am, he said respectfully, I think this gentleman might need some medical attention. He doesn't look too good. Sarah looked at Brad with apparent concern. You're right. Brad, are you feeling okay? You look like you might be having some kind of panic attack. Brad tried to respond, but could only produce a series of strangled gasps. Danny, Sarah said, turning to Brad's nervous companion, you might want to get him some fresh air, and maybe consider calling it a night. He seems to be having trouble handling this level of social interaction. Danny nodded frantically and began trying to pull Brad off his bar stool. Brad offered no resistance. He seemed to be in a state of near-complete mental shutdown. Wait, Sarah said, and both Danny and the stocky man froze. Before you go, I want to make sure there are no misunderstandings about what just happened here. She looked directly at Brad, who was now leaning heavily against Danny and breathing in short, panicked gasps. You came into this bar tonight believing that you were superior to the people here. You made assumptions about their backgrounds, their capabilities, and their worth based on superficial observations and your own prejudices. You loudly proclaimed that military personnel were weak, that they would back down when confronted by people like you, that their authority was fake, and their toughness was an act. Brad's eyes were wide and unfocused, but he seemed to be listening. What you discovered, Sarah continued, is that your ability to read people is not as accurate as you thought it was. That your assumptions about military personnel are not based in reality. And that true authority and true toughness don't necessarily look the way you expected them to look. She paused, letting this sink in. Now, I could make this a lot worse for you. I could share some stories about the kinds of situations my teams have handled, the kinds of pressure they operate under, the kinds of capabilities they possess. I could explain in detail what it actually means to command people who are trained to use lethal force. I could describe some of the things I've personally done in service to this country. Brad made a small moaning sound. But I'm not going to do that, Sarah said, because I think you've learned enough for one evening. And because, despite what you might think, I don't actually enjoy humiliating people who are clearly outmatched. She picked up her beer and took a small sip. What I want you to do, she said, is leave this bar quietly. Go home. Sleep off whatever you've been drinking. And tomorrow, when you wake up, I want you to think very carefully about what happened here tonight. Brad was now slumping against Danny, who was struggling to support his weight. Think about how quickly your confidence disappeared when you realized you were wrong about who you were dealing with. Think about how your body reacted to being confronted by someone with real authority. Think about how little your business success and your money meant when you found yourself in a situation you couldn't control. Sarah's voice remained calm and level, but there was an unmistakable note of steel underneath. And most importantly, she concluded, think about how lucky you are that this conversation is ending with you walking out of here on your own 2 feet instead of being carried out by paramedics. Because I want to be very clear about something. The restraint I've shown tonight is not weakness. It's professionalism. And it's a courtesy that not everyone in my position would extend to someone who had been as disrespectful as you've been. Danny was now pulling frantically at Brad's arm, trying to get him to stand up and move toward the exit. Brad seemed to have recovered just enough motor function to stumble along with Danny's guidance. One more thing, Sarah called after them as they began moving toward the door. The next time you're tempted to make assumptions about people based on their appearance or their jobs, remember this moment. Remember how completely wrong you were about me, and consider the possibility that you might be just as wrong about other people you encounter. The stocky man, who had been silent for several minutes, finally found his voice. "We're sorry," he said quickly. "We didn't mean any disrespect. We were just talking." Sarah looked at him for a moment. "You weren't just talking," she said. "You were making judgments about people's worth and value based on prejudice and ignorance. You were dismissing the sacrifices and service of people who risk their lives to protect the freedom that allows you to sit in bars and complain about them." The man opened his mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it. "But," Sarah continued, "I appreciate the apology, and I hope that all 3 of you will take some time to reconsider your attitudes toward military service and the people who choose to serve." She gestured toward the door where Danny was still struggling to get Brad moving in the right direction. "Now I suggest you help your friend get home safely. He's clearly had enough excitement for one evening." The stocky man nodded rapidly and hurried to help Danny with Brad, who was still in a state of semi-conscious shock. Together, they managed to get him moving toward the exit, though it was clear that Brad was in no condition to walk steadily on his own. As they reached the door, Sarah called out one final time. "Oh, and gentlemen, you might want to find a different bar for your future conversations. Pete here takes care of his customers, and I suspect you wouldn't be particularly welcome back here after tonight." Pete the bartender nodded grimly. "That's right," he said loudly enough for the departing trio to hear. "We don't serve people who disrespect our military here." The door closed behind them with a definitive thud, and the bar remained silent for several more seconds. Then, gradually, conversations began to resume, though everyone continued to glance occasionally in Sarah's direction. Sarah remained at the bar for several minutes after Brad and his companions left, finishing her beer and allowing the tension in the room to gradually dissipate. The other patrons were clearly dying to approach her, to ask questions or express their support, but something in her demeanor suggested she preferred to be left alone for the moment. Pete the bartender was the first to speak. "Commander," he said respectfully, "can I buy you another beer?" "On the house, obviously." Sarah looked up at him and smiled for the first time that evening. "Thanks, Pete. I'll take one more, but you don't need to comp it. I'm off duty." "Ma'am, with all due respect," Pete replied, "after what you just did for every veteran in this place, your money's no good here tonight." As Pete opened a fresh Corona and placed it in front of her, Sarah became aware that the atmosphere in the bar had changed completely. Where there had been tension and hostility 30 minutes earlier, there was now something approaching reverence. She could feel the eyes on her, but it was no longer the uncomfortable attention of people watching a confrontation develop. It was the grateful attention of people who had just witnessed someone stand up for them in a way they never could have managed themselves. An older man at the far end of the bar caught her eye and raised his beer in a silent toast. Sarah nodded in acknowledgement and raised her own beer in response. The gesture was copied by several other patrons, creating a moment of quiet solidarity that spoke louder than any words could have. "Commander Martinez," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to find a young woman in her 20s wearing a navy t-shirt. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to say thank you. My boyfriend is deployed with the Marines right now, and hearing that guy talk about military service like that, it was really getting to me." "What's your boyfriend's name?" Sarah asked. "Lance Corporal Miguel Reyes. He's in Afghanistan with the 2nd Battalion." Sarah nodded seriously. "Lance Corporal Reyes is lucky to have someone who supports him the way you do, and he's doing important work over there, no matter what anyone in this bar or any other bar might say about it." The young woman's eyes welled up with tears. "It's just hard sometimes, you know? When people talk about the military like it doesn't matter, like the people serving are just, I don't know, losers or something. Miguel is one of the smartest, bravest people I've ever met." "I'm sure he is," Sarah replied. "And I'm sure he knows how much you believe in him. That matters more than you might realize." As the young woman returned to her table, Pete leaned across the bar. "Commander, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is it true what you told that guy about commanding SEAL teams?" Sarah took a sip of her beer and considered the question. She was normally very careful about discussing her work, especially in civilian settings. Operational security was always a concern, and she'd learned over the years that revealing too much about her position could complicate her life in unexpected ways. But tonight felt different. The confrontation with Brad had already put her identity in the open, at least within the confines of this bar. And the people here had earned some honesty from her. "It's true," she said simply. "Though I should probably clarify that when I say I command SEAL teams, it's not quite as dramatic as it might sound. Most of our work involves a lot of training, planning, and preparation. The actual operational stuff is a smaller part of the job than movies make it seem." Pete grinned. "I bet it's still more exciting than pouring drinks for a living." "Different kinds of pressure," Sarah replied diplomatically. "I've never had to deal with drunk college kids, or manage inventory, or handle the kind of customer service challenges you face every night. Every job has its difficulties." An older man who had been sitting quietly at a corner table approached the bar. Sarah recognized him as one of the people who had raised their beer in the earlier toast. He was probably in his 60s, with gray hair and weathered hands that suggested a lifetime of physical work. "Commander," he said, extending his hand, "Tom Patterson. I served in Vietnam, Army Infantry, 43rd Infantry Division. I just wanted to shake your hand and tell you how much I appreciated what you did tonight." Sarah shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Patterson. And please call me Sarah. We're all off duty here." Tom smiled. "Sarah it is. And call me Tom. I have to say, in all my years, I've never seen anyone handle that kind of situation as well as you just did. That guy was completely out of line, and you put him in his place without raising your voice or losing your cool." "He was just drunk and shooting his mouth off," Sarah replied. "Most people aren't as obnoxious as that when they're sober. Maybe, Tom said, but the things he was saying, those weren't just drunk opinions. That was genuine disrespect for everyone who's ever put on a uniform. And the way he was talking to you personally, calling you sweetheart and acting like you were some kind of decoration, that really got under my skin. Sarah nodded. I've heard worse, believe me. But I appreciate your support. Tom hesitated for a moment, then continued. Can I ask you something? When you revealed who you were, when you showed him your identification, did you know he was going to react the way he did? Sarah considered the question carefully. I had a pretty good idea. People like Brad usually have very strong opinions about things they don't understand, but they also tend to fold pretty quickly when confronted with reality. He spent 20 minutes telling everyone how he could intimidate military personnel, but he'd clearly never actually tried it. You think he was all talk? I think he was someone who had succeeded in a limited environment and mistakenly believed that success translated to every other situation. Real estate development requires certain skills: negotiation, financial analysis, project management. But it doesn't necessarily prepare you to handle unexpected confrontation or to function effectively when your assumptions turn out to be wrong. Pete, who had been listening while cleaning glasses, joined the conversation. The way he just shut down when he realized who you were. I've seen a lot of tough guys in this bar over the years, but I've never seen anyone react like that. Sarah took another sip of her beer. Fear is a funny thing. When someone's confidence is based on feeling superior to the people around them, it becomes very fragile. Take away that sense of superiority, show them they've misjudged the situation, and their whole mental framework can collapse pretty quickly. Is that something they teach you in the military? Tom asked. How to read people like that? Partly, Sarah replied. But it's also just experience. When you're responsible for people's lives, you learn to pay attention to personality types, to recognize when someone is operating beyond their actual capabilities. Brad was exhibiting a lot of classic signs of someone who was overconfident and underinformed. A woman at a nearby table had been listening to the conversation, and she finally worked up the courage to approach. She was middle-aged, wearing scrubs that suggested she worked in healthcare. "Excuse me," she said nervously. "I don't want to interrupt, but I just had to say something. My son is in the Navy, stationed in Norfolk. He's only been in for 2 years, but he's already deployed twice. Well, I heard that man talking about military service being welfare for losers. It made me so angry I could hardly see straight." "What's your son's rating?" Sarah asked. "He's an electronics technician. He works on radar systems, I think. I don't really understand the technical stuff, but he loves what he does." Sarah smiled. Electronics technicians are crucial. The systems your son works on literally keep ships safe and operational. Without people like him, none of the fancy stuff gets done. The woman's face lit up. "Really? He always says his job isn't that important, that he's just fixing equipment." "Your son is being modest," Sarah replied. "Electronics technicians are some of the most skilled personnel in the Navy. The equipment they maintain and repair is incredibly complex, and when it breaks down in the middle of the ocean, they're the ones who have to figure out how to fix it with whatever tools and parts are available. I'll tell him you said that. He'll be so proud to know that someone like you thinks his work matters." As the woman returned to her table, Tom shook his head in amazement. "You know, it's funny. That guy Brad was going on about how military people aren't special, how they're just government employees doing easy jobs. But listening to you talk about these different positions, it's clear that you actually understand what people do, what their contributions are. That's part of leadership," Sarah explained. "You can't effectively command people if you don't understand their capabilities and their value." Brad's mistake was assuming that because he didn't understand military roles, those roles must not be important. Pete refilled Sarah's beer without being asked. "Can I ask you something, Commander? I mean, Sarah, when you're actually leading SEAL teams, is it as intense as people think it is?" Sarah considered how to answer that question. The reality of her job involved classified operations that she couldn't discuss, but she could speak generally about leadership challenges. "The intensity comes and goes," she said finally. "There are periods of extreme pressure where every decision matters, and the stakes are life and death. But there are also long periods of training, planning, and routine operations. The key is maintaining the same level of professionalism and attention to detail regardless of the immediate pressure level. How do you handle it? The pressure, I mean. Training mostly. By the time you're in a position to command special operations teams, you've been through years of progressively more challenging situations. You learn to break complex problems down into manageable pieces, to focus on what you can control, and to trust your training and your people. Tom leaned forward with interest. What about dealing with people who question your authority? I imagine commanding special operations guys can't be easy, especially for a woman in what's traditionally been a male environment. Sarah appreciated the directness of the question. You're right that it can be challenging. SEALs are strong-willed, highly confident people who are used to being the best at what they do. They don't automatically respect authority just because someone has a higher rank. So how do you earn their respect? The same way you earn anyone's respect, by demonstrating competence, by making good decisions under pressure, by showing that you understand their capabilities and their needs. The men I command don't care about my gender. They care about whether I can do my job effectively and whether I'll make decisions that give them the best chance of completing their mission and coming home safely. A younger man who had been playing pool in the back of the bar approached their group. He was probably in his late 20s, with the kind of lean build that suggested military service. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. I'm Marcus Thompson, Marine Corps, recently separated. I just wanted to say that what you did tonight was exactly what I would have wanted someone to do for me." Sarah shook his hand. "What was your MOS, Marcus?" 03 Sute Unsprezice, Mom. "Infantry. Did 3 deployments in Afghanistan. Welcome home, Marine. How are you adjusting to civilian life?" Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "It's been tough, honestly. I've been looking for work for 6 months, and I keep running into people who think military experience doesn't translate to civilian jobs. They assume that all I know how to do is shoot guns and follow orders." Sarah nodded understandingly. "That's a common misconception. Infantry Marines are some of the most adaptable, resourceful people I know. The problem is that civilian employers often don't understand how military skills translate to their environment." "Exactly," Marcus said. "I mean, I've led teams under extreme pressure. I've made life-or-death decisions. I've solved complex problems with limited resources. But when I tell employers that, they just see grunt infantry and assume I'm not qualified for anything." Tom had been listening with interest. "What kind of work are you looking for, son?" "Honestly, I'm open to almost anything. I've applied for security jobs, construction management, even retail management positions. I'm willing to start at the bottom and work my way up. I just want someone to give me a chance to prove myself." Pete suddenly looked thoughtful. "Marcus, what kind of experience do you have with people management?" "I was a team leader for my last 18 months in the Corps, responsible for 12 Marines, everything from training to discipline to operational planning." "And how are you with handling difficult customers?" Marcus smiled for the first time since joining the conversation. "Sir, I've dealt with Taliban fighters and Afghan warlords. I think I can handle difficult customers." Pete grinned. "I might have an opportunity for you. The bar owner has been talking about expanding operations, maybe opening a second location. He's looking for someone to manage the new place, someone who can handle staff, deal with problem customers, maintain security without creating unnecessary drama." "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. The pay wouldn't be amazing to start, but there'd be growth opportunities if you prove yourself. And after what I saw tonight with Commander Martinez handling that situation, I'm reminded that military leadership skills might be exactly what we need in this business." Sarah watched the exchange with satisfaction. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes sense, Pete. Military leadership experience is incredibly valuable in civilian contexts. It's just a matter of finding employers who are smart enough to recognize it." Marcus looked like he could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Mr. Pete, if you're serious about this, I would love to discuss it further. I promise you won't regret giving me a shot." "Let me talk to the owner tomorrow," Pete replied. "Come by Thursday evening around 6, and we'll sit down and talk through the details." As Marcus thanked Pete enthusiastically and returned to his pool game with noticeably lighter spirits, Tom shook his head in admiration. That's the kind of thing that should happen more often. People helping each other out, recognizing value where it actually exists. It is, Sarah agreed. And it's a good reminder that positive things can come out of negative situations. If Brad and his friends hadn't been such jerks tonight, we probably never would have had this conversation, and Marcus might not have connected with Pete. Speaking of Brad, Tom said, "Do you think he learned anything from tonight? Or will he just go home and convince himself that you were the problem?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Honestly, he'll probably try to rationalize what happened, at least initially. People like Brad don't usually change their fundamental worldview based on one experience, especially one that was embarrassing for them. But he'll never forget how it felt when he realized he was completely wrong about who he was dealing with. That kind of fear, that complete loss of confidence, it stays with you. So even if he doesn't change his opinions consciously, he might be a little less quick to shoot his mouth off in the future. Pete wiped down the bar thoughtfully. "You know, in the 15 years I've been working here, I've seen a lot of confrontations. But I've never seen anyone handle one quite like you did tonight." "How so?" "Most people, when they get into an argument like that, they either back down or escalate. They either let the other person walk all over them, or they turn it into a shouting match, or worse. But you just methodically dismantled everything he said without ever losing control or getting emotional." Sarah shrugged. "It's part of the job. When you're commanding people in high-stress situations, you can't afford to let your emotions drive your decision-making. You have to stay calm, assess the situation objectively, and respond in a way that achieves your goals without creating unnecessary problems." "What were your goals tonight?" Tom asked. "Initially, just to have a quiet beer and decompress from a long day. When that became impossible, my goals were to shut down the disrespectful behavior, correct some dangerous misconceptions, and hopefully send a message to everyone else in the bar that military service deserves respect." "Mission accomplished," Pete said with a grin. Sarah finished her second beer and placed the empty bottle on the bar. "I think it's time for me to head home. Early morning tomorrow." "Of course," Pete said. "But before you go, I just want to say again how much I appreciate what you did tonight. For Marcus, for that young lady with the deployed boyfriend, for all the veterans in here who had to listen to that garbage. And for yourself," Tom added. "You didn't have to reveal who you were. You could have just finished your beer and left. But you chose to stand up and set the record straight, even though it meant dealing with an unpleasant confrontation." Sarah stood up and reached for her wallet, but Pete waved her money away. "I told you, your money's no good here tonight." "Thank you, Pete. And, Tom, it was an honor to meet you. Thank you for your service in Vietnam." "Thank you for continuing the tradition," Tom replied, shaking her hand again. As Sarah walked toward the exit, conversations throughout the bar paused as people nodded respectfully or raised their drinks in acknowledgement. She nodded back, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding the sentiment behind it. Outside, the night air was cooler than when she'd arrived, and the street was quieter. Sarah took a deep breath and began the walk back to her car, reflecting on the evening's events. In many ways, what had happened tonight was a microcosm of larger issues she dealt with regularly. There were always people who made assumptions about military capabilities, military personnel, and military leadership based on incomplete information or outright prejudice. Usually, she didn't have the opportunity or the inclination to correct those assumptions directly. But tonight had been different. Brad's comments had been so over-the-top offensive, so completely wrong, that silence would have felt like complicity. And the setting had been such that she could respond without compromising operational security or creating diplomatic complications. The result had been satisfying in several ways. Brad had received a much-needed reality check about his own capabilities and limitations. The veterans in the bar had seen someone stand up for their service and their sacrifice, and Marcus had potentially found a new job opportunity that could help him transition successfully to civilian life. As she reached her car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her executive officer, reminding her about an early morning briefing on upcoming training exercises. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to lead and serve. But tonight had been a good reminder of why that service mattered, and why the respect and gratitude of people like Pete and Tom, and Marcus made all the challenges worthwhile. Sarah got in her car and headed home, already mentally preparing for the next day's duties. The encounter with Brad was behind her now, just another minor incident in a career full of much more significant challenges. But she suspected that for the people in the Anchor Bar, it would be a story that was told and retold for years to come. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself back at the Anchor Bar, though this time the circumstances were entirely different. She'd received a text message from Pete asking if she could stop by when she had a chance. Apparently, Marcus Thompson wanted to thank her personally for how things had worked out. The bar looked exactly the same as it had that night, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where there had been tension and hostility before, now there was a sense of comfortable familiarity. Pete waved from behind the bar as she entered, and several other patrons nodded in recognition. Marcus was indeed there, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks instead of the casual clothes she'd seen him in before. He looked more confident, more settled, and there was an energy about him that suggested good things had been happening in his life. "Commander Martinez," he said, standing up from his bar stool as she approached. "Thank you so much for coming. I wasn't sure you'd have time. It's good to see you, Marcus. And please call me Sarah. How are things going?" Marcus's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Better than I could have hoped for. Pete introduced me to the owner, Mr. Rodriguez, and we hit it off immediately. I started as assistant manager last Monday, and I'm already learning so much about the business side of things." Pete leaned across the bar with a satisfied expression. "Kid's a natural. He's got great instincts for reading people. He handles difficult customers without breaking a sweat, and the staff respect him already." "That's wonderful," Sarah replied, genuinely pleased. "I'm not surprised, though. The same skills that made you an effective team leader in the Marines translate perfectly to this kind of environment." That's exactly what Mr. Rodriguez said. He told me that military leadership experience was actually exactly what they needed, that they'd been looking for someone who could maintain order without creating drama and who could make quick decisions under pressure. Sarah took the beer Pete offered her and settled onto a bar stool. "How are you finding the transition? Is civilian management different from what you expected?" Marcus considered the question thoughtfully. "It's different, but not as different as I thought it would be. The basic principles are the same. You have to understand your people, you have to be fair but firm, you have to lead by example. The stakes are lower than they were in Afghanistan, but the fundamental leadership challenges are surprisingly similar." "Give me an example," Sarah said. "Well, last Saturday night, we had a situation that reminded me a lot of your encounter with that Brad guy. 3 college kids came in, already drunk from somewhere else, and started harassing some of our regular customers, making fun of their clothes, their jobs, acting like they were better than everyone else. How did you handle it?" Marcus's expression became more serious. "I used basically the same approach you did that night. I stayed calm, I didn't escalate the situation, but I made it very clear that their behavior was unacceptable and that they needed to either change their attitude or leave. And they chose to leave. But not before one of them tried to get tough with me, telling me I was just a bartender and couldn't tell him what to do. So I explained, very politely, that I was a combat veteran who had dealt with much more serious threats than drunk college students, and that he really didn't want to test my patience further." Pete laughed. "You should have seen the kid's face. Went from tough guy to scared little boy in about 2 seconds. Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right approach. Project confidence without making threats. De-escalate when possible, but make it clear that you're not someone who can be intimidated or pushed around." "I learned it from watching you," Marcus replied. "The way you handled Brad that night was a masterclass in controlled confrontation. You never raised your voice, never made specific threats, but you completely dismantled his confidence and sent him home with his tail between his legs." Speaking of Brad, Pete interjected, "You'll never guess what happened with him." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Oh, he came back," Pete said with obvious satisfaction. "About a week after that night with you. He was by himself this time, no friends with him, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping well." "What did he want?" Sarah asked. "He wanted to apologize. Specifically to you, but since you weren't here, he asked me to pass along the message. Said he'd been thinking about what happened and realized he'd been completely out of line. Marcus leaned forward with interest. Really? He actually admitted he was wrong. More than that, Pete continued. He said the experience had been a wake-up call for him about his own attitudes and behavior. Apparently, his wife had been telling him for years that he was becoming arrogant and disrespectful, but he never really listened until that night when he found himself face-to-face with someone who could back up their authority. Sarah was genuinely surprised. That's actually pretty mature of him. I wasn't sure he had that kind of self-reflection in him. There's more, Pete said. He asked if he could buy a round for everyone in the bar as a way of apologizing to the people who had to listen to his nonsense that night. And he left a $100 tip with instructions to buy drinks for any veterans who came in. Wow, Marcus said. That's not what I would have expected from the guy you described. Sarah thought about this development. People can surprise you sometimes. Maybe getting his worldview completely shattered was exactly what he needed to take a hard look at himself. He also asked, Pete added, if I thought you might be willing to meet with him sometime so he could apologize in person. I told him I'd ask you next time you came in, but that I wasn't making any promises. Sarah considered this. What's your read on it? Do you think he's genuinely changed, or is this just him trying to restore his ego somehow? Pete was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking carefully about his answer. Honestly, I think it's genuine. He looked smaller, somehow, less arrogant, like someone who had finally realized that his success in one area didn't make him an expert on everything else. Plus, Marcus added, the fact that he came back at all says something. It would have been easier for him to just avoid this place entirely. Coming back to apologize took some courage. Sarah nodded slowly. You're both probably right. And honestly, if he's genuinely learned something from the experience, then maybe some good came out of that unpleasant evening. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Patterson. The Vietnam veteran Sarah had met that first night. He looked pleased to see her and immediately came over to shake her hand. Sarah, good to see you again. How are things with the Navy treating you? Can't complain, Tom. How about you? How's retirement? Tom grinned. Much better since I found this place. Pete here runs a good establishment, and the company has improved significantly since certain undesirable elements stopped frequenting it. You heard about Brad coming back to apologize? Sarah asked. I did indeed, and I have to say it restored a little bit of my faith in human nature. Not everyone is capable of admitting when they're wrong and trying to make amends. Marcus looked thoughtful. In some ways, this whole situation has been good for everyone involved. I got a job opportunity, Brad got a reality check he apparently needed, and everyone in the bar that night saw that disrespectful behavior doesn't have to be tolerated. That's a good point, Sarah replied. Sometimes conflict, as unpleasant as it is, can lead to positive changes if people are willing to learn from it. Pete was serving drinks to a couple at the other end of the bar, but he returned quickly to rejoin the conversation. Actually, that brings up something I've been thinking about.